I knew the first lie the moment my daughter said, "Mom," like a stranger. "We're leaving for Europe tomorrow. I sold the lake cottage in your Subaru. We needed the cash. You'll be fine." Click. That was the sound of 43 years collapsing into a dial tone while I sat under the buzzing lights of Dr. Patel's waiting room, a gardening magazine open to an article about wintering roses that suddenly felt obscene. People think heartbreak is loud. Mine arrived as a hush. The kind you get when the ocean pulls back before a wave you can't yet see. My name is Martha Quinn. I'm 70, and 5 months ago, my husband, Samuel, said, "Morning, honey," over oatmeal and never said another word. After the funeral, my only child, Lila, began orbiting like a dutiful planet, rides to the bank, list taped to my fridge, a smile that used to read as love and now looked suspiciously like inventory. I didn't cry when she hung up. I watched dust float through a rectangle of fluorescent light and felt something I hadn't felt since Samuel left the table cold: direction. 3 days before he died, he slid a blue envelope into my palm and said, "Top drawer, when you're ready." Grief had piled blankets over that memory until Lila's voice yanked them off. The nurse called my name. Dr. Patel listened to my heart, told me it sounded stubborn in a good way, and reminded me to sleep. I nodded, thanked her, and walked past the parking space where my Subaru would have been. The bus hissed, and I climbed aboard, palms still steady. City blocks flicked by. The bakery where Samuel and I used to split a cinnamon roll for science. The hardware store where the owner knew our porch screws by size. The pawn shop with guitars that never quite tune. Everyone in motion had their own private storm. Mine was finally a compass. Lila believed she had trimmed me down to need, but Samuel had always planned like a chess player, hiding queens where pawns looked harmless. At home, I set my purse on the kitchen chair he'd carved nicks into with those nervous thumbs, and went straight to the bedroom. Top drawer, left side, under the scarves that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, the envelope, thin as a secret and twice as heavy. I carried it to the bed we'd warmed for half a century and sat the way you sit before a verdict, back straight, breath even, ready to become the person who knows. The house had that late afternoon quiet I used to call lonely and now recognized as room to think. Outside, Mr. Gomez's sprinkler clicked on. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked at nothing important. Inside, I slid a finger under the flap. A brass key tipped into my palm, followed by a letter in Samuel's meticulous, square handwriting, the kind that makes every sentence behave. Martha. It began, and I could hear his voice in the curves. "If this is in your hands, I am not in mine. Forgive me for quiet wealth. Peace needed privacy. We own more than the cottage. There are 6 properties, including Lila and Victor's building, plus stakes in 3 companies, all under Havenstone LLC. You, my love, are the owner." My throat went dry and then, absurdly, laughed. One startled breath at the idea of my shop teacher husband, king of patched overalls and secondhand radios, architecting an empire beneath the floorboards of our ordinary life. Tucked behind the letter were copies, deeds, filings, dividend stubs, evidence that the world I thought I understood had a basement. My phone buzzed again on the nightstand. "We deposited your share," Lila said, syrupy soft. 30%. That should float you while we find you a studio. Victor's Barcelona deal is huge, Mom. Be happy for us." She hung up before the word no could test its legs. I set the phone face down, slid Samuel's key into my pocket, and stood. I didn't rage. I didn't plead with the past to return my husband or my daughter or the Sundays when cinnamon rolls were research. I took my purse, locked my door, and headed back to the bus stop. If heartbreak is the wave, readiness is the stance. I was ready.
I didn't sleep that night, not really.
I lay on top of the covers listening to the house breathe, counting the seconds between the old heater's sighs and the refrigerator's grumble, as if they were metronomes for a life that had finally revealed its downbeat. And at dawn, I put Samuel's brass key in my pocket, wrapped a scarf against the bite in the ear, and took the 7:10 bus downtown to the bank with the kind of quiet purpose I imagine saints carry when they walk into fire. The vault clerk was a young man with a contagious politeness. "Good morning, Miss Quinn." And he led me through a corridor that felt colder than winter, even in late spring. Box 119 slid out like a drawer of history. He left me alone at a little table with a lamp that made a cone of light feel like privacy. Inside the steel rectangle was Samuel's handwriting again, steady as ever, and beneath it, folders clipped and labeled, copies of filings, a ledger in pencil, and a smaller envelope that read, "Open after you breathe." I made myself inhale, long and slow, then broke the seal. If you're here, you chose steadiness over fury. Good. We own more than you think because the world always asked us to be smaller than we are. Call attorney Mei Chen. Keep all of this quiet. Let lessons ripen. A business card slid out. Cream stock, crisp font, Mei Chen, SQR. And below it was the thing that turned knowledge into proof. Certified deeds with Havenstone LLC stamped like a secret handshake. Ownership of 4 duplexes, a tiny strip mall I recognized from errands, a downtown condo I'd only ever admired from the bus, and, my breath caught, the title to the very building where Leela and Victor rented a unit with a balcony she liked to pose on for photos. There were quarterly statements from 3 companies I'd never heard of, notes in the margin in Samuel's steady block letters, steady performer, diversify, only reinvest dividends, and a thin notebook recording rental income and repairs in an affectionate shorthand only a man who loved both order and the smell of sawdust could write. Buried in the stack, a post-it in his voice. Don't confuse mercy with rescue. I shut my eyes, saw his hands, scarred from a lifetime of tools, guiding mine through this blindfolded maze, and I felt something in my spine stand up. I checked out of the vault with the folders hugged to my chest like a hymn book, and stood on the sidewalk among suits and coffee cups, the city opening its weekday mouth to swallow another morning. The florist downstairs spilled color into the air. I bought lilies on impulse because Samuel liked how they smelt like clean rooms, and stepped into a phone booth of sunlight to call the number on the card. Mei Chin, came a voice that was all clarity. "Miss Chin, my name is Martha Quinn. My husband, Samuel, left me your card with instructions. I think I need to show you something he built." There was a brief silence that felt like a door clicking open. "Can you come today?" she asked. "I can," I said. And when she gave me the address, I realized it was above this very florist, as if Samuel had arranged even the coincidence of fragrance. Her office had the precise calm of a well-kept toolbox, one plant thriving, books in a row, a window that let the morning in without apology. I laid the folders out. May read without theatrics, pen tapping once when she found a notary seal, twice when she saw the structure of Havenstone. "Your husband was careful," she said finally. "This is clean, airtight. The lake cottage sale your daughter orchestrated is void. She had no authority to convey title. We can unwind that immediately with minimal noise because buyers were bona fide but misled. They'll be made whole by the party that misrepresented. The car sale is trickier. She used a limited power of attorney you signed after the funeral. We'll challenge on misrepresentation and condition. As for the rest, these properties are yours. I recommend we transfer day-to-day control to you directly and keep Havenstone's member anonymous for now. If your goal is discretion, we can move like fog." I nodded, throat tight with a gratitude that felt unceremonious, not for money, but for the architecture of protection Samuel erected while whistling over oatmeal like an ordinary man. May watched me, reading something in my face. "There's another thing," I said, voice low. "I don't want a courtroom spectacle. I want education. My daughter has turned our life into a ledger. I want her to learn the math of consequence." May considered, then nodded slowly. "Education can be conducted under seal," she said. "We can file, unwind, and position without a headline. We can time an eviction notice at the legal minimum once you have full control of that building. It will arrive as a fact, not a fight." I exhaled, a long, even ribbon. "Do it," I said. She slid a stack of forms toward me. I signed my name so many times it began to look like a map of its own country. On the way home, the bus rocked through neighborhoods that now carried footnotes only I could see. This duplex would get new plumbing before winter. That corner lot would need a new roof by summer. The barber, who always waved at me, rented from us without knowing he was waving at his landlord's widow. When I unlocked my front door, the house smelled faintly of lilies and lemon oil. I set Samuel's ledger on the table beside the flowers and felt something settle. Not triumph, not revenge, but alignment. Leela thought she had stripped me down to helplessness. It turns out she had just stripped away my excuses. May moved like a metronome set to patient. No wasted beats, no dramatic flourishes. So the next 10 days unfolded with the kind of quiet precision that makes you believe in engineering as a love language. In the mornings, I wore the costume of the abandoned widow. Cardigan, sensible shoes, the soft voice hellos people reserve for breakable things. And in the afternoons, I sat at my kitchen table under Samuel's ledger and signed papers that turned fog into form. We unwound the cottage sale first. May filed the rescission, contacted the buyers, and presented them with a path that let them keep their dignity while returning my shorelines. They were misled, she said, eyes on the clauses, and we will make them whole without teaching the neighborhood a new word for gossip. I drove out with her 2 days later, yes, in my own Subaru, which she had tracked to a lot 2 towns over and negotiated back for a premium that felt less like paying and more like reclaiming posture, and stood at the gate breathing the old, clean smell of dune grass and salt. The buyers, a retired couple in matching windbreakers, met us with apologies and relief. I shook their hands and thanked them for tending the porch plants, meaning it. By the time the spring tide polished the dock, the deed were my name again, and the key on my ring sounded like a bell when it tapped the steering column. Back in town, May shifted our attention to control, transferring property management from the shell Samuel had built to me, updating registered agents, setting up accounts that gathered rent with the efficiency of rain gutters. She liked to say we were closing loops. I like to think of it as latching doors Samuel had installed and left for me to find. In the afternoons, I walked past the building where Leela and Victor rented, a 14-story brick ribcage catching the last sun, and counted the tiny lives stacked in windows. A blue bicycle on a balcony, a plant that had learned to lean, a child's paper cutout taped to glass. The doorman, Nolan, who had held umbrellas over Leela and her shopping bags without knowing he was bowing to his landlord's daughter, tipped his cap to me like he always had, and I returned the gesture with a cookie from the bakery Samuel loved because they never skimp on butter. On those walks, I practiced the neutrality I would need when the first letter arrived. How to keep my face at rest, my voice even, my kindness intact. In the background hum, rumors began threading themselves through the neighborhood. Mr. Gomez reported, with the solemnity of a weatherman, that Victor's opportunities were merely storm clouds dressed as confetti. A teller at First Harbor, who used to wink when Samuel deposited rent in cash, as if money were a punchline we all understood, told Aurora from the corner shop that a file with Victor's name had thickened with signatures that didn't match. I didn't feed the rumor mill. I fed my azaleas and kept meetings with May. One evening, May spread a clean blueprint of the building on my table, and we mapped what stewardship would look like once the papers finished their turn through the clerk's hands. Re-roof before the first heat wave, replace the rattling elevator car cables, add LED fixtures in dim hallways, refresh the boiler filters, and, my insistence, commission a mural in the alley that would make children grand and grown men walk slower. You're not just recovering assets, May observed, penciling in a timeline. You're rebuilding a neighborhood contract. I felt Samuel's yes pass through me like a wire that found its current. Between calls and lists, I trained myself into small rituals that kept me from spinning into sentimentality. I brewed tea exactly 4 minutes. I oiled the squeaky hinge on the pantry door instead of giving it a pass. I folded the dish towels into precise thirds, the way Samuel liked. Not because towels matter, but because the habit of care does. When the letter carrier paused at my gate one afternoon and handed over a certified envelope addressed to Havenstone's manager with my street name on it for the first time, my pulse tightened but didn't rattle. Inside were the finalized transfers, the registered manager confirmations, and one sheet that read like a drumbeat. Notice of possession and control, effective immediately. I laid it beside Samuel's ledger, open to a page where he'd scrawled in pencil, "Don't confuse mercy with rescue," and I understood my next steps with the kind of clarity grief sometimes grants the living. I would secure what was ours, steady what sheltered others, and teach my daughter the difference between a handout and a handhold without ever raising my voice. The rumor didn't arrive as a whisper, but as a knock. Mr. Gomez at my porch with 2 tomatoes cupped like evidence and a look that said he wasn't bringing vegetables. Martha, my cousin at First Harbor, says Victor's loans are stacked like chairs at closing time, wobbly, borrowed, and about to topple, he murmured. And by dusk, the wind had blown the rest of the story down our block. An Instagram story of Victor in Seville with the blonde tucked under his arm and a caption about fresh starts. No Leela in sight, no mention of business, only nightlife and a watch too new for an honest man. I didn't text her. I let the air do the hard work distance sometimes does. The next morning, May slid a manila envelope across my table that felt heavier than paper has any right to be. "Final confirmation," she said, tapping the top sheet. "Havenstone's manager of record is you. We can move on occupancy notices, quietly, properly, by statute." I read the notice language, every syllable clean and unadorned, and felt the peculiar ache of a parent sharpening a necessary blade. "Send the one for Unit 12B, I said, steady, though my mouth tasted like pennies. May nodded, professional mercy in her eyes, and by noon, Nolan, the doorman, had signed for the envelope addressed to Leela and Victor. The clock started counting 30 days as ruthlessly as any tide. That evening, the news showed a silent clip of our airport's arrivals. Leela, in oversized sunglasses, dragging a single suitcase like a fallen plan, shoulders hunched against recognition. And I turned off the sound, but not my heart. The phone rang the next morning at exactly 8, as if shame and panic had set an alarm. "Mom," a scrape of breath. "I got a letter. It says I have to vacate the apartment in 30 days. Paper rattled. "From Havenstone. Do you know them?" I looked at Samuel's ledger, at the penciled note about mercy and rescue, and chose my answer the way a surgeon chooses an incision. "It sounds official," I said. "Come over. We'll read it together." She arrived within an hour, smaller than her clothes, that brittle brightness gone from her voice, and replaced by a rawness that made me think of knees skinned back to childhood. She hovered in the doorway as if she didn't deserve crossing it. I opened my arms, and she stepped in with the stiff awkwardness of someone unused to asking. In the kitchen, her hands worried the notice until the fold wore white. "Victor left," she said, words tumbling. "He said there was a deal in Barcelona, and then there was a girl, and then there was no deal, and then I couldn't reach him, and then the bank called and—" She stopped, swallowed. "Mom, I said terrible things to you. I acted like you were a bill I could cancel. I can't fix it. I don't even know where to sleep next month." The part of me named mother, older than marriage, older than mortgage, The part that once woke at 2 a.m. to check fever and at 16 years to sit on the edge of a bed and listen to heartbreak stood up inside me and wrapped both arms around my ribs so I wouldn't wobble. "You can stay here," I said, "for as long as we need to untangle this." Relief and humiliation flickered across her face like heat lightning. "I'll find work," she blurted. "I'll clean offices. I'll sell the last of my jewelry. We'll make a list," I said, gentle as I could be without blunting reality. She cried then, not the performative tears of someone auditioning for absolution, but the ugly, useful kind that leaves salt tracks and room to breathe afterward. When she retreated to her old room with her suitcase, I stood at the sink and watched the neighbor's maples stipple the sunlight and thought about timing, about how Samuel, who despised spectacles, had somehow built me a stage where I could teach without ever pointing a finger. That afternoon, Leela returned with a small padded mailer she said she'd found in a box of Victor's papers, my name on it in Samuel's careful hand. "Another envelope?" she asked, curiosity and fear braided tight. "Apparently, your father had a fondness for them," I answered, and I opened it while she watched, fingers trembling. Inside, a brass key on a red string and a single line in Samuel's pencil. "Use this only if our girl has burned her illusions to embers." I felt both the cruelty and the care of that sentence, and knew with the certainty of a tide chart that the next lesson would not be about money at all, but about weight. How to carry what you've done and still learn to walk. Lila's first night shift started on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays are what life uses to test her stamina. By 7, she was buttoning a borrowed navy polo in my hallway mirror, tugging at the hem the way girls tug at promises, and I watched her swallow whatever pride tasted like when you've spent the last month chewing it. "It's just for now," she said, as if naming the temporary might keep it from hardening. And I nodded, poured coffee into a dented thermos, stirred in honey because shame birds on the way down, and packed her a sandwich the way I used to for field trips, paper bag folded precisely so she'd feel held even if she pretended not to. When the door closed behind her, the house changed temperature. I cleared the table, set Samuel's ledger in the center like a compass, and read his penciled notes until my heartbeat matched his tidy columns. At midnight, I couldn't stand the quiet and walked the block, porch lights like constellations, Mr. Gomez's wind chime trying to make music from whatever the wind gave it. And when I came back, I left the thermos on the porch with a note under the lid: "Hydrate your bones." She returned at 2:30 a.m., uniform cleansing with the honest sweat of other people's messes, eyes rimmed but not empty. "The crew is mostly women who could run cities if someone gave them keys," she said, kicking off shoes. "Mrs. Rivera taught me a trick for streak-free class and said there are 2 kinds of cleaners, the ones who never got a door and the ones who slammed a door on themselves. I told her I'm the second kind." She didn't cry when she said it. She looked steadier for having named it. In the morning, after she slept on the couch because the old room smelled too much like trophies and posters and a girl who never paid a bill, we took Samuel's brass key on the red string to the bank. The vault hummed and the clerk's shoes squeaked on tile. And when box 311 slid open, the velvet pouch inside landed in my palm with a weight that felt less like wealth and more like a tutorial. There were the family pieces I recognized: Grandma Quinn's locket, Aunt Joe's emerald ring, a bracelet Samuel bought me when we couldn't afford anything, but did anyway. And there were new ones, tagged with appraisals in that square handwriting. "Sellable if lesson requires liquidity. Do not liquidate unless teaching stewardship." Lila's breath hitched. She reached for the locket first, then pulled her hand back as if touching would break something more than metal. "This could pay down the scariest loans," she said, then caught herself, eyes flicking to me. "I mean, the ones I signed without reading." I closed the lid gently. Jewelry doesn't erase a signature, but it can buy time while you learn to read. On the way home, we stopped at 3 shops. None as generous as the appraisals, each with lighting designed to make stones look like stars. Lila chose to sell 2 pieces Samuel had marked low sentiment, and kept the locket and my ring with the kind of reverence that reads as planning rather than hoarding. At the kitchen table, she divided the cash into envelopes she labeled in block letters: rent for someone else now, utilities, food, debt hold. and left a blank one under the fruit bowl labeled household, sliding in 220s like rent to the universe. "You don't owe me that," I said, already softening. "Then let me owe myself something," she answered, and the certainty in her tone surprised me. The next days built their own plain rhythm. Sleep, scrub, soup, search. She applied to a clerkship at the DMV because paper needs people who have learned to fear signatures. And she watched videos about wages and credit like they were nature documentaries she'd missed in school. I rehearsed steadiness by calling May from the laundry room, where the spin cycle could swallow the words fraud and warrant if they ever escaped. May, unflappable, reported that Victor had indeed attempted to parlay a counterfeit romance into residency in Spain, that his debts were matryoshka dolls, one inside another, and that 2 banks would accept evidence of forged signatures if we could pry it from a notary who suddenly remembered nothing. "How much hope do I portion out?" I asked, sitting on the dryer as if it were a warm bench. "None yet," May said. "Let the lesson finish baking. We'll plate it when it's set." I hung up and ironed dish towels because control has to land somewhere. Each night, Lila came home with a new fact and a smaller ego. That ammonia will curl your lungs if you hurry, that office lights left out all night make a person suspect waste everywhere, and that her feet could ache and still cross a room to help someone carry a box to the elevator. She told me Mrs. Rivera's story. Husband gone, 3 kids, 20 years of cleaning, and not one complaint that she couldn't translate into a plan. And then she told her own without embroidery. "I sold your life to fund a lie," she said one dawn, read more from effort than sorrow. "And when the lie left me, I walked to your door because you built it into me that doors are for knocking, not kicking." I wanted to say I had also built a net, a company, a quiet empire of roofs and boilers and leases, but Samuel's note about mercy and rescue thrummed like a low chord. So I handed her the thermos and a banana and said the only thing that felt useful. "Go shower. It's payday at noon, and dignity likes being on." May called on a gray Thursday and said she had movement, which in her vocabulary meant proof had finally put on shoes. I was pruning the azaleas when the phone buzzed, soil under my nails, and by noon I was in her office above the florist watching her lay out a neat sequence of pages that turned suspicion into facts. Copies of loan packets with Leela's signature slanted in a way it never slants. A notary stamp used on a day the notary's log shows he was at his mother's funeral. A bank surveillance still of Victor walking in with the folder and walking out with the grin. And an email from a Spanish consulate clerk confirming that the marriage application he filed abroad listed a fiancé who shared a lease with the bartender and a bulldog named Tito. "Fraud stacks like this," May said, tapping with her pen. "And when it stacks, we can unstaple Leela from liability." I felt relief arrive like weather, but refused to let it rain yet. "Quietly," I reminded, and she nodded, already filing motions with names that sounded like polite commands: vocator, rescission, discharge, and promising me we'd have orders in 3 weeks if nothing snarled. I walked home with my spine an inch taller and found Leela in the kitchen with the yellow legal pad and a calculator, chewing the end of a pencil like a teenager about to tell the truth. She'd drawn boxes, income, essentials, payment plan, and had written DMV clerk interview, Monday, at the top in block letters that looked sturdy. "Mrs. Rivera says if I can face the fluorescent lights at 2 a.m., I can face a counter with a number dispenser," she said, half laughing, half terrified. We practiced interview questions between boiling pasta and rinsing lettuce. I asked her why public service matters, and she answered that paperwork is where power hides, and that she wanted to be the kind of person who points to the right line instead of the wrong door. That night, a bank called about a delinquent account, and I watched Leela tell the truth without adding sugar. I signed things I didn't read. My husband forged things I didn't know. I'm working nights and I can pay $50 this week, but not $500. And when the woman on the line said thank you for not pretending you're someone else, Leela covered the receiver and mouthed, "Is this what adulthood sounds like?" And I nodded so hard my glasses slipped. Between calls, I tended to the building the way Samuel would have wanted. Met the elevator man in the dim shaft to talk about cables, scheduled the boiler flush, ordered the new LEDs, and chatted with Nolan about a muralist he knew who could turn the alley into color. Kids should see a whale or a rocket when they take the trash out, I told him, and he grinned like a boy who'd just been told the pool opened early. In the mail that afternoon arrived a small padded envelope postmarked Madrid, addressed to Leela and Victor's rushed scrawl. She turned it over like a stone, then set it on the hall table without opening it. "Not today," she said simply, and there was a strength in that no that I trusted more than any tear. At dawn on Monday, I drove her to the DMV, the Subaru idling like an old dog happy to be useful, and we sat in the lot for 5 minutes so she could breathe through the tremor in her hands. "You don't have to become a different person," I said, squeezing her fingers. "You have to become a truer version of the one who knocked on my door." She smiled, small but real, and walked in. An hour later, she came out with a tentative glow and a second interview slip. We celebrated with diner pancakes at 11 because clocks are for schedules, not for joy. And she told me the manager, Ms. Wilkes, with a silver bun and a stare that saw through flimsy, had asked her to describe a mistake, and Leela had said, "I mistook convenience for love and silence for safety." And Ms. Wilkes had said, "That'll do." Back home, May texted that one bank had capitulated early, dropping Leela's name from a note with a thud you could hear through the screen. And I allowed myself a single deep breath of relief before returning to discipline. There was still the eviction clock, still the lesson plating in the oven of consequence. That evening, as Leela laced her sneakers for the night shift, she picked up the Madrid envelope and walked it to the trash. "No more souvenirs from fires," she said, and I watched her tie the bag with a firm, clean knot. After she left, I took Samuel's ledger from the shelf, ran my fingers over the groove his pencil had worn into the spine, and read his favorite line again. "Don't confuse mercy with rescue." Then set it beside a stack of freshly signed work orders and the muralist sketch, a rocket rising from a sea of blue with room on its flank for a name. I wrote one in pencil, erased it, and wrote another, "Doorways," then whispered into the quiet kitchen, "Almost, Sam. Almost time." May scheduled the meeting for a Friday that smelled like rain, the kind of day the sky practices restraint. And I told Leela only that a lawyer had agreed to see us about options, which felt honest enough to fit inside my mouth. On the drive downtown, she traced the seam on her jeans and read the muralist's sketch I'd left on the passenger seat. Rocket, stars, the word doorways penciled soft along the fuselage, and said, half to herself, "I'd like to be a hinge instead of a handle." And I took that sentence into my pocket like a coin. May's office, above the florist's, had lilies again, their clean room scent making the air feel newly laundered. She greeted Leela the way she greets every file that might turn back into a person, calm, clear, with a respect that honors the wreckage without worshiping it, and slid a folder across the table. "Miss Quinn," she said, "this is the first part." Leela opened it, eyes flicking as if reading were a new language. Motions granted, signatures declared fraudulent. The notaries miraculously remembered Mother's funeral, pinning down a date like a thumbtack. She whispered the words as if they might vanish if spoken too loud. Discharged, vacated, rescinded. May let the relief land and then nodded toward a second, thicker folder. "And this is the context," she said, looking to me, and I felt the familiar tightening of the string between mercy and rescue. I slid the heavier folder to my daughter. Inside lay Havenstone's bones, deeds, operating agreements, bank statements, the manager filings we'd completed last week, Samuel's square handwriting in the margins like handrails on a steep staircase. Leela read in silence until the shape of it stood up for her. Then she closed the folder carefully, as if it contained a sleeping animal, and looked at me. "You," she said. Not accusatory, not incredulous, just the word, heavy enough to tilt the table. "Samuel," I corrected softly, "and then me." Her face did a dozen small things, a flinch, a swallow, a brief flare of anger at herself for missing what love looks like when it's quiet, and then settled into something I hadn't seen since she was 10 and built a lopsided birdhouse and realized birds might still choose it. How long have you known? From the week you left for Europe, I said. I found the first envelope, then the rest. I called May. We unwound the cottage. We brought home the car. We shifted the building into my hands. We sent the notice because consequences don't wait for feelings to catch up. She looked at the rain stippling the window, considered the word consequences, the way a jeweler turns a stone under light, and nodded once, as if agreeing to gravity. You watched me mop floors, she said, voice neither bitter nor bruised, while you could have written a check. I didn't flinch. A check would have padded the fall, I said, but you needed a floor. She barked an unexpected laugh, short, astonished at its own sound, and then covered her mouth, eyes wet. I was cruel to you, she said. I treated you like overhead. I itemized your love. You answered with a syllabus. May pretended to rearrange papers so the moment could be ours. Your legal slate is clean, she added quietly. The banks have released you. Victor's situation is progressing elsewhere. Leela didn't ask where. She didn't care. Do I get to keep my job? She asked me instead, a half smile lifting. I've grown fond of unlocking doors at midnight. That's your choice, I said, and meant it. But don't keep it to punish yourself. Keep it if the person who walks in wearing that badge is someone you respect. She nodded, serious as oath-taking. Then she took my hand, my left, the one with Samuel's ring warm from the drive, and squeezed it with a steadiness that said the apology had left her throat and reached her bones. Thank you for not rescuing me, she said. And I heard Samuel's pencil scrape in that sentence. The line he wrote and rewrote, don't confuse mercy with rescue, finally sounding like a bell in both our chests. On the way out, May stopped us at the door. One more thing, she said, sliding over a slim envelope addressed to Havenstone. The mural permit. Approved. Leela laughed, a softer version of the girl who once laughed at ducks in rain, and we walked downstairs through the florist humidity into a street that had switched from drizzle to light. I unlocked the Subaru, and before I could start it, she touched the rocket sketch again. Doorways, she read. Let's make some. I looked at her profile, thinner, yes, but truer, and thought of the cottage, of women stepping over a threshold they feared and finding soup on the stove and a list on the fridge that begins with breathe. We will, I said, turning the key. The engine caught, faithful as ever, and the wipers swept the last of the blurring from the glass. The morning we painted the first stroke of blue on the alley wall, the sky matched us, and I took it as permission to begin. Nolan hauled out ladders like they were old friends. Mr. Gomez arrived with a cooler of lemonade and a swagger that said he'd been waiting his whole life to be on a crew. And Leela tucked her hair into a bandana, the way women do when they mean business, sleeves up, eyes clear, responsibilities owned. We titled the project Doorways on the permit May slid across her desk last week, and the muralist, Kaya, a soft-spoken comment with paint under her nails, sketched a rocket rising from waves that looked suspiciously like the lake at our cottage, stars scattered above like punctuation marks for a sentence we were still writing. By noon, the alley had stopped being a place where dumpsters soaked and become a corridor children wandered into with that particular bravery kids reserve for color. One little boy in a superhero t-shirt asked if the rocket needed a pilot, and Leela said yes, but pilots can be anyone who knows how to knock. And I felt Samuel somewhere near my shoulder, pride humming like an old radio tuned just right. We drove to the cottage that afternoon with the Subaru's trunk stuffed. Clean linens, a bulletin board, index cards labeled with things I wish someone had handed me as a young mother. How to read a lease, how to close a credit card properly, who to call when the light over the stove flickers and you're sure it's a bad omen, but it's just the bulb. We scrubbed baseboards until they stopped complaining, labeled the pantry with kindness and logic, and we wrote the house rules on the back of a tax form because every good shelter starts with making do. 1. Breathe. 2. Cook something simple. 3. Change the sheets. 4. Leave the porch light on for the next woman. 5. Dignity in, dignity out. Leela handled the city paperwork like a new language she decided to be fluent in. Her DMV clerkship turned into a job offer after Miss Wilkes called and said, "We need people who admit mistakes out loud." And my daughter said yes without punishing herself with penance. She kept her night shifts for 2 more weeks, not to suffer, but to say goodbye properly to the women who had become her committee of uncles, bringing Mrs. Rivera a bouquet from the florist downstairs and a handwritten invitation to the cottage's first quiet opening, a phrase we chose because ribbon cuttings felt like parties thrown at storms. May came too, in weekend clothes that made her look like a neighbor instead of the person who turned our crisis into documents. She stood on the porch Samuel built and ran a palm along the railing as if blessing it, then handed me a slim folder of approvals that would have made my younger self faint, a foundation account with a name that made my throat swell, Samuel and Martha Fund for Doorways, a maintenance schedule that would outlive both of us, and a single typed page titled Stewardship, Not Secrecy, with bullet points that translated our private vows into public practice. Edward sent one more letter from Europe, all apologies and ankles, but Leela read 3 lines, folded it cleanly, and slid it into a file labeled Lessons. Not to reread, but so her future self would know she had been the kind of woman who files what no longer owns her. We welcomed our first guest on a soft evening that smelled like tangerines. Her name was Tasha, eyes bruised by a long season of no, and a toddler asleep on her shoulder. She stood in our doorway like someone expecting a test and saw instead a stove already warm and a note that said, "You decide tonight's pace." Leela made soup without fanfare. I showed Tasha the locket hooked by the bed. Small valuables feel bigger when they're safe. And the little boy woke for 2 minutes just to laugh at the rocket sticker we'd pressed beside the light switch. Later, on the porch, after the dishes stacked themselves like promises kept, Leela sat with her knees against the railing and said, "I don't want to be forgiven as a daughter. I want to be trusted as a partner." And I reached for her hand with the ring Samuel gave me. The band, now a tiny circle that contains a life's worth of circles. In the weeks that followed, the building breathed easier. LEDs softened corners that had hoarded worry. Elevator cables hummed like an instrument tuned. The mural drew chalk hopscotch grids every Saturday, and word about the cottage traveled not as gossip, but as a map, passed between women who needed a night with a lock they controlled, and a list that began with breathe. Sometimes on late drives back to town, the road ribboned us toward a future that felt as sturdy as a ledger and as soft as a porch light, and I'd say out loud, "We did it, Sam." And the tires would thrum back a rhythm steady enough to count. The story didn't end with a gavel or a headline. It ended and began here. A daughter who knocks, a mother who opens, a key on a red string, a rocket painted in an alley that teaches kids to look up, and a house by the lake that has decided finally to be a doorway.